in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Knocking at the College Door regional webinar series. Today's webinar is Data and Implications for the Western Region. My name is Peace Brandsberger and I'm the Senior Research Analyst at the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, otherwise known as WICHE, and co-author of Knocking at the College Door. I will be your moderator today and will be joined by two respondents who will provide thoughts on the implications of these trends for their state, higher education enrollment and access, workforce trends, and state and institutional decision-making. Before we get started, WICHE would like to thank ACT and the College Board for their generous financial support of Knocking at the College Door. Without their partnership and collaboration, these projections wouldn't be possible. First, I'd like to run through a bit of housekeeping information. All attendees will be muted. However, you should be able to hear at this point. You can click on the small orange box to the right side of your screen to access the audio tab, to connect via your computer speakers or see dial-in information. We'll be taking all questions today via the question box, which you'll find in the control panel on the right of your screen. We'll monitor and respond to incoming questions throughout the webinar, so please submit your questions as they occur to you. We'll also have time for questions and answers towards the end of the webinar. The presentation slides and copies of the Knocking at the College Door report are included for you to download from the handouts portion of your control panel. After the webinar concludes, we will post the recording of the presentation on our website, and we'll let you know by email when it is available. Lastly, you'll be directed to a brief evaluation of the webinar when you exit. We rely on your feedback to help us develop useful resources, so we appreciate you taking the time to complete the short evaluation. Today, I will present the high school graduate trends as the first part of the webinar. Then we'll hear from our panelists, Kim Post of Denver Public Schools Office of College and Career Readiness, and Rod Gramer with Idaho Business for Education and Workforce, about their impressions of the projections and what they mean for the work that they do. Again, we'll have time at the end of the webinar to address your questions, so please submit them in the questions box. Let me begin with a few important details about the data that you will see. We use what is called a cohort survival ratio method to generate the projections. We gather the most recently available data from the Federal Common Core of Data and Private School Survey. For this edition, school year 2013-14 was the most recent data for the most part, with some variation across public and private school data. From these data, we compute ratios, or patterns of progression from grade to grade on to high school graduation, and carry forward the 5 most recent years' patterns as part of the projections. If we used just student data, we could only project about a decade out. We add in data about births in recent years to project about 18 years out. So, based on the data that we accumulate, the projections begin with school year 2013-14 by and large, and extend out to school year 2031-32. We make projections for the nation, region, 50 states and the District of Columbia, and for the first time this edition, also for Puerto Rico and Guam. We are able to disaggregate the numbers by race, ethnicity for public school students, which are about 90% of the total. We continue to produce detailed public school numbers in the 5 long-standing racial ethnic categories: Hispanics, which now include all students of any Hispanic origin regardless of race, and 4 non-Hispanic race categories: White, Black, Asian Pacific Islander, and American Indian Alaska Native. We provide some information about the proportions of 2 or more races or multiple race students and Hawaiian Pacific Islander students in the report, even though we couldn't produce projections for these populations separately because of data limitations. Over the years, the number of U.S.-born kids and how they fare getting through school has been the primary determinant of the high school graduate trends. We do not explicitly model or quantify what influences students' progress through school. Things such as being retained in a grade or promoted early, moving between schools or states, policy changes, or economic or other environmental factors. These sorts of things are implicit in the data counts and therefore in the ratios. We also can't know exactly how much immigration adds to high school graduate numbers, but our analysis indicates it was notable in prior years of high immigration and has reduced recently with declines in immigration. You can find detail about the data and methodology in the appendix of the report. So let's begin with the national trends for high school graduates. The big national headlines are that despite the recent improvements in the official high school graduation rate, the sheer number of youth is moderating. This leads to a slowdown and even declines in the number of high school graduates. And the long predicted decreases in the number of white youth is underway, including those who attend and graduate from private schools. At the same time, non-white student populations have rapidly increased. These two charts illustrate the projected national trends. All of our charts use assigned colors to indicate the student race ethnicity categories. So throughout these charts you will see blue for white students, green to indicate Hispanics, gold to indicate black students, a taupe color for Asian Pacific Islanders, orange for Native American, American Indian, Alaska Native, and gray for private school students. So the chart on the left shows the populations of public school graduates by race ethnicity plus graduates of private schools from the first projected year to the last. The top line shows the total and counts in several school years, roughly around 2020, 2025, and 2030. The picture is that after almost 2 decades of steady growth of between 1.5 to 2% annually, the nation's high school graduating class reached a high of about 3.44 million grads around 2013. Between now and about 2025, virtually no increase is projected, except for a few years of small increase out towards the year 2025, when the nation will produce about 3.5 to 3.6 million high school graduates. After the year 2025, the national number of high school graduates is projected to decrease steadily to about 3.3 million, about 7% fewer by around the year 2030. These decreases in the outer years arise from long predicted contraction of the white youth population, compounded by dramatic birth declines for all populations during and after the recent Great Recession. The line chart on the right of this slide indicates the year-over-year change in the number of each category of graduates compared to the last confirmed school year, 2013. White public school graduates are projected to decrease by 17% by the early 2030s, about 250,000 fewer graduates than in 2013. Barely a decade and a half ago, around 2000, white high school graduates represented 70% of all high school graduates. They are projected to be about 52% of public school graduates by the end of the projections. Unforeseen increases in the number of non-white high school graduates could tip the balance to majority-minority within the span of the projections. Hispanic high school graduates are the primary growth population, increasing almost 50% by 2025, from 640,000 in 2013 to almost 9,000 by that point. During the growth years, the additional number of Hispanic graduates more than offsets the declines of white graduates. But then, even Hispanic graduates are projected to decrease in number between the year 2025 and the early 2030s, as a result of the recent birth declines, which were greatest among Hispanics. Asian Pacific Islander graduates are the only population projected to increase throughout the projections, but they are only about 5 to 7% of the total number of graduates nationally, so their numbers don't shift the overall trend of decline. Black high school graduates are about 15% of the national total, and they will be relatively steady in number throughout the projections. The numbers for American Indian Alaska Native students nationally are very small compared to the other student populations, but they overall see a decline also. High school graduates from private religious and independent schools are projected to decrease by about 26%, roughly 80,000 graduates, in reflection of their largely white student demographic, but also due to significant contraction among religious schools over the last decade or so. We couldn't produce separate counts for Hawaiian Pacific Islander graduates or two or more races graduates because of data limitations, but recent years indicate that Hawaiian Pacific Islander graduates are about 7% of the combined Asian total, or about 10,000 high school graduates in recent years. Graduates of multiple races have represented between 1 to 3% of non-Hispanic public high school graduates in recent years. The national projections, of course, mask significant variation by region and among the states. Here we see the regional differences. The number of graduates for each region you see here is the region's high point. The Northeast and Midwest reached their high points for high school graduates around school year 2009-2010. The number of graduates from these regions have already begun decreasing and will continue to decline throughout the projected years. The South is the engine of growth for high school graduates. By 2025, it will generate about 10% more graduates than in 2013 and is primarily responsible for the growth predicted for the nation out around the year 2025. About 45% of the nation's graduates will be from the South region by 2030. And now let's look at the trends for the Western region. I should mention that WICHE puts North and South Dakota in the West region, not the Midwest region, because they are WICHE member states. Here again you see the two charts as shown for the nation. The chart on the left shows the overall graduating classes and populations relative to each other. The West generally tracks the national trend with slight increases through the year 2025 and then decline. The West overtook the Midwest region in terms of the number of high school graduates produced by around 2010 and now produces about 30% of the nation's high school graduates. The West region has long been the most diverse region and produced the most Hispanic and Asian Pacific Islander graduates of all the regions. Perhaps the most surprising thing for the West is the rapid contraction in high school graduates that is projected after 2025 at slightly higher rates of decline than the nation overall. This is explained by the chart on the right. The West is impacted by reductions in the number of white high school graduates, but less so than the nation overall. Rather, the West's projected declines in high school graduates in total after 2025 arise from dramatic declines in the number of Hispanic graduates. By the end of the projections, the South will produce more Hispanic graduates than the West and have virtually the same rate of diversity in its high school graduating classes. And while Asian Pacific Islander graduates are a growth population for the other regions, in the West, their numbers remain at best stable and may even decline slightly. The West produces almost half of the nation's American Indian Alaska Native high school graduates, and their numbers are projected to decrease somewhat over the course of the projections. The knocking at the college door projections focus on high school graduates, but we also produce grade-level enrollment projections by state and race ethnicity as part of generating the graduate numbers. The enrollment projections are useful glimpses of current and near future waves of students in the school pipeline. This chart of enrollments by race ethnicity over 3 decades illustrates how demographic shifts in earlier grade levels leads to future graduate trends. The elementary and middle school projections, which are shown in the 2 lighter colors of each bar, end in earlier years than do the high school projections. So the full pipeline snapshot is available only for the year 2000, 2010, and 2020. This illustrates the contraction in white enrollments over those decades, occurring at the same time as substantial increases in Hispanic and Asian Pacific Islander enrollments, in particular, albeit much slowed for both of those groups around 2020. Finally, let's take a quick peek at each of the states in the West. Hopefully some of the similarities and differences will jump out at you as you see the states one by one and side by side. We don't have time to dive into all of the details for each state, so I'll just call attention to a few things. The West region as a whole is shown again at the top with relatively little increase in the number of high school graduates overall, ending in declines. Non-white graduates are already about 54% of the total and increase 3% to 57% of the total by the early 2030s. For each of the states shown, we provide two summary data points: the average number of graduates annually throughout the course of the projections and by how much the non-white portion of graduates will increase or decrease. So looking at Alaska, Alaska has a generally flat trend with small increases for all but white graduates through about 2025. Arizona has generated about 8% of the West's high school graduates, and California 55% in recent years. Both of these states are projected to have 14% fewer high school graduates by the early 2030s. While many of the West states are projected to have some increase, the declines in these two states contribute substantially to the projected declines for the region. In both states, the declines are concentrated with Hispanic graduates. On this slide, you see several of the Western states which are projected to have growth throughout the years projected. We will hear from Kim Post soon about what Denver is experiencing. As for Colorado as a whole, it is projected to have a steady number of white high school graduates, plus abundant increases of Hispanic and Asian Pacific Islander graduates. It's about the same pattern for Idaho, the state for our second speaker, but in fact, Idaho is projected to experience slightly greater rates of increase in Hispanic graduates than the region, which Rod might be able to comment about. Nevada and New Mexico are projected to experience 12 to 15% decreases in the number of high school graduates by the early 2030s, largely with Hispanics. Hawaii and Montana will have moderate increases in high school graduates, with increases for the most part arising from Hispanics. The remaining Western states on this slide are all projected to have increases of high school graduates overall, with Oregon being the only one of them that will increase through around 2025, but then fall back a number below where it started. For all of these states, the growth primarily comes from Hispanics, with some small addition from other minority graduates, Oregon included. Wyoming and Utah will also see increases of white high school graduates. North Dakota is projected to have rapid increases across the board in each race ethnicity, predicted by the rapid in-migration for the oil and gas industry, which could of course change depending on what occurs going forward with that industry. That concludes the presentation of the trends for the West. You can obtain the projections in a variety of formats by going to our website at www.knocking.witsche.edu. You can get PDF copies of the report, which includes the state-by-state numbers in Appendix A. You can download the projections as an Excel file on the data page, and you can view state, regional, and national profiles about the projections, which also include other contextual indicators about academic preparation, educational attainment, and family incomes by race ethnicity for each state. At this moment, I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions that we should take before we turn this over to our panelists. If you have any questions at this point that you would like answered, please type them into the question panel, We'll continue to monitor that. But for now, I'd like to turn it over to our panelists, Kim Post from Denver Public Schools and Rod Gramer from Idaho Business for Education. Kim, we're going to start with you, so if you could please be sure that you are unmuted. I'd like to ask you both to take 2 or 3 minutes to describe your organization and your initial impressions of Knocking's findings. So Kim, I'll start with you, and then we'll turn it over to Rod.
Hi, great. This is Kim. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. I'm thrilled to be here. As you know, Denver Public Schools, or as you may not know, Denver Public Schools is one of the fastest growing public school districts in the country, although we are projecting many of the same things that the Witchy report has done in terms of leveling off of our growth moving forward. We project that will continue for some time as the number of kindergartners are also declining in our projections. Our enrollment currently is around 92,000 students, with approximately 69% students of color, and that's 55% Hispanic, 13% Black, so very closely mirrored to what you're seeing in other states as well. Our free and reduced lunch rate is around 68%. Teacher-student ratio is one of the best in the state. We have current teacher-student ratio of about 15 students to 1 teacher, which is lower than lots of other places. In our district, we have 39 traditional high schools that include a big mix of large comprehensive high schools, smaller mission-driven schools, and then what we call intensive pathways programs. And then a nice combination of charter schools as well, so 19 charter schools in addition to the 39 traditional high schools, with growth in those areas really on the increase, projected to be around 27% of our total enrollment in charter schools by 2027. Current grad rates around 65%, our on-time completion rates around 66%. I think those things are important to know. And then, I think that for students that are attending college, we find that DPS students tend to continue to be a little bit below the state average in terms of those students going into post-secondary programs, persistence, credits earned, grad rates, and remedial rates. But all those things over time have been improving, and we've been seeing some nice gains in those things. We do exceed the state average in terms of FAFSA completion rates and Pell recipients. In terms of, we're a large district that has, like any other district in Colorado, some funding challenges. Although enrollment is increasing overall, the combination of what we're seeing in the Denver metro area of gentrification in Denver and slower birth rates during the recession have really slowed our growth. And then as our economy has improved, we're still seeing this mixed shift from free and reduced lunch eligible students to reduced, as well as a decrease in the total number of at-risk students. And those two factors in combination provide us with less funding in some of our programs such as Title I and general reduction in kind of K-12 local funding as well. I think I'll stop there and then hand it over to Rod.
Hi, Rod. If you want to make sure you're unmuted, and if you'd take a couple of minutes and describe your organization and your initial impressions of Knocking's findings from the perspective of the work that you do. So we'll figure out what happened with Rod's audio. In the meantime, Kim.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. So Idaho Business for Education, we're a group of 181 businesses and business leaders from all across our state. And our mission is to try to improve the education system in Idaho so that we can both set students up for success in school, work, and life, and to build the workforce that our employers need for the 21st century. Our overarching goal is the same as the state of Idaho, and that is to have 60% of our 25, 34-year-old adults holding a post-secondary credential of some kind. It doesn't have to be a 4-year degree. It could be a workforce-ready certificate to 2-year associate, to baccalaureate, or even advanced degrees. The challenge we have as a state and as an economy is that right now only about 40% of our workers, adult workers, hold any post-secondary credential, and we're the 5th lowest state in the country in that regard. Compounding our problem is that we also have one of the lowest go-on rates in the United States. We do a fairly decent job of graduating students from high school, even though it's gone down in the last year, but only 46% of our high school graduates go on to post-secondary. So as you can see, that we have a critical need to have more students go on and get some level of credential. In regards to the report, it just magnifies, I think, the problem that we have as a state, and maybe other states have as a state as a problem as well. And that is, not only do we need more kids of all ethnic backgrounds to go on, but the study sort of, I think, amplifies the need to ensure that especially our Hispanic students and students of color, they get the kind of education they deserve so that they are more likely to go on. And I think the study really emphasizes how critical it is for us as a state and as a country, for that matter, to really tackle the achievement gap in a big way. Because if we don't, it's pretty clear that none of us are going to be able to not only set students up for success in work, school, and life, but also to create the economic, the economies that our states and our country needs in the 21st century, because we need a more educated workforce all across the board for our economy to thrive in this century. So I think I'll leave it at that, and I have a few more thoughts about that, but answer questions.
Thank you, Rod. This is Peace again. And so I'd like to ask, since we started with Kim, I'll ask Kim this question first. If you could maybe expound a little bit about what Rod ended up with there, which is the achievement gaps between the current still majority white student population, but soon to not be majority, and Hispanics and other underrepresented student groups. Can you discuss what these projections mean specifically in Colorado or the Denver area, and give us some examples of what Denver Public Schools has been doing to achieve some improvement in academic performance and college readiness for each student group across the board, but of course also for those who struggle the most?
Yeah, and we struggle with the same issues in terms of really persistent achievement gaps among our white students and our students of color in particular. I think we have many of the same goals, that every child succeeds in Denver, that we have great opportunities for making sure that we have high quality schools in every neighborhood. We know that success shouldn't be defined by a zip code in terms of where students live in a particular neighborhood. So we're doing just a few things that I think are really important, and one of them is redefining what it means to be college and career ready. DPS has just adopted new graduation requirements aligned with the state, but actually at a little bit of a higher bar than what the state is recommending, where we are expecting our students for the class of 2021 to demonstrate competence in both English and math, which means that it's no longer going to be sufficient for students to sit in the classroom and have a D average and then move on to whatever is next for them, but they actually have to demonstrate competence in both English and math. But we've looked at that in terms of a variety of pathways that students are able to pursue. So not just advanced placement, international baccalaureate, and SAT, which is the most common areas in which students move through and move on to college, but then also expanding what our notion of college is to include CTE certification, concurrent enrollment, military exams, portfolio assessment, so that students have multiple ways of being able to meet these benchmarks rather than just a test score as they're moving through. We've also really increased and expanded our participation in what we've called traditional CTE programs, which DPS has rebranded Career Connect, by pushing down exposure to workforce programs down into the elementary programs, middle schools, and then high schools, with intentional development with business and higher education partners to build intentional pathways for students where they can see their future much, much earlier and understand what it means to be, what different engagement opportunities are as they're moving through their entire educational experience. So we're building out internship programs and mentoring and work-based learning, really trying to make learning come to life at much earlier grades. And we're finding great success in terms of our students being really engaged and excited about particularly STEM and business programs out throughout the district, including working with business and industry and developing a 13th and 14th year residency or apprenticeship program. So making sure that that pipeline is the transition from high school into college, whatever college looks like for them, is seamless and transparent. We're increasing our interest in kind of early college models where we're taking concurrent enrollment and dual enrollment programs and pushing them down into the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grades. 9,500 courses taken in the last year, which is phenomenal. In making sure that when we implement international baccalaureate and advanced placement cultures into buildings, that it's not just for a select group of students, that it's serving school-wide expectations. In fact, DPS was recognized as College Board's Large Urban District of the Year last year for not only increasing the numbers of qualifying tests, but also the success of our students and the diversity of our students. Other things like, decreasing the student-to-council ratio, increasing our emphasis on college partnerships, and I guess we'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. But I think that's really key for us, is making sure that the transition that kids go from high school into college, in terms of are they ready, financial aid applications, college applications, summer opportunities, summer melt, early orientation programs. We collaborate very, very closely with the City and County of Denver, Denver Scholarship Foundation, all of our college partners that are in the Denver metro area, our mentoring, tutoring programs, etc. And then really making sure that we're targeting our funding down to our earlier grade levels. We know that if students aren't able to demonstrate proficiency in reading and math by 3rd grade, it's very, very difficult to get them on track as they're moving up. So making sure that we're redesigning math and English to align with Common Core, we're transitioning students from elementary into middle, and then what are the expectations from middle into high school, etc. So that's just a few of the things that we've been doing to really make sure that we're being very targeted and intentional about getting our kids ready.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Rod, if you wouldn't mind picking up, since you raised the issue of attainment gaps, and given the changing demographic, the necessity to address those attainment gaps for the overall improvement on the overall rates, both for high school graduation, the workforce, the economy. If you wouldn't mind picking that up, and you can, but in particular, if you know of work that you lead or that is being conducted in Idaho to actually address these gaps and show some improvement against what you raised as a critical issue.
Thanks, Peace. Yes, I think going back to my earlier remarks, what's so significant about this study is that it really puts a magnifying glass, if you will, on this critical issue of achievement gap. And I know as a country we've talked for years, if not decades, about the achievement gap. And if it was easy to solve this, we probably would have all solved it by now. And I think the first recognition is that there's no silver bullet to this. But I think as states and as a nation, I think this study shows the imperative and urgency of us focusing on this issue like a laser and really coming to grasp with it and getting it solved. We've got to narrow this gap if we're going to be successful in education and in our economy. And just some things, we like to think about the education continuum as a continuum, education as a continuum. And the business community feels strongly that the earlier we can invest in education, the more better results we're going to get. And so I think that, you know, we've got to start with a strong and a stronger early education program in the country. Idaho is one of 5 states without state support for pre-K, which probably comes shocking to the audience on this call. But so we have a lot of work to do. But even as a country, we don't invest enough in early education. And that was going to set the strongest foundation for our young people. And it really is about proficiency, especially in some of the fundamentals like reading and math. Because if kids can't read, they can't learn. And I think as a country and as a state, we also have to start thinking about, especially for this special population, we've got to start thinking about this as a community-wide issue. It's not just an issue for our schools, but it's an issue for our communities. And we've got to start looking at community solutions and wraparound services for our students, because they don't live in an island called education, they live in an island called community. So we've got to look at things like healthcare, we've got to think about after-school programs, and we've got to think about how the community supports the education community around this. The third thing that I just touch on is that we've got to do a better job, I think, of intervention. We have to make sure that as students are struggling, we come down on that problem as a education, as a community, and really intervene so that students who are struggling, especially in the early years with math and reading, that we really intervene early and intervene strongly in that so that they don't fall behind, because it's when they start falling behind that we start losing them. So that's very, very important to make sure that we intervene as quickly as possible, especially in the early years. We are moving toward, in Idaho, a mastery-based education system. We have 19 pilot programs in schools across the state, and I think that that's going to be very important. And I think Kim touched on this, where we just don't move kids along before they're ready to move on. And that ties into this whole idea of making sure that those early years, especially, we start laying those foundations. But those are some of the things we can do. People much smarter than I am probably have other ideas, but certainly the fundamental thing we have to do is focus on this single-mindedly, because if we don't focus on it single-mindedly, we are going to be in a world of hurt in a very short amount of time, and I think that's what this study shows.
Thank you. So I'm going to take a break here and actually address a couple of questions we received from the audience, and then I'll be coming back to Kim and Rod. In the meantime, Kim and Rod, you have both sort of discussed the topic of whole community approaches, or at least public-private sorts of approaches to things. So we'll hear from you in a minute about your thoughts and examples on that. A couple of the questions that I'll entertain, and in fact some of what you've already mentioned, relates to policy, and in a time of presidential transition, also just recent changes in different states, perhaps including yours, you know, what might be coming down the pipe in terms of new policies and how that will impact these trends. So if you'll bear with me while I answer a couple of questions and have a few thoughts about that, just about the community-wide or partnership approach, and perhaps if you have any thoughts for our audience about policy changes that you're anticipating or would recommend. So we have a couple of these questions a little bit about the, if you will, methodology and how we got to the numbers. One of the questions asks for a little clarification about whether or not the trends that we project, which we had the greatest level of detail we're able to reliably make projections about, is race ethnicity from the available data. And so that's a primary way in which we can disaggregate the trend from the overall total. And the question is whether or not the numbers that we're showing take account of the differences between the different groups, or if they are based on the overall average rate of students progressing into high school and then through high school to high school graduation. The answer is that our methodology does take account of the variation by the different student populations. So we do not use the official high school graduation rate, which is a percent of 9th graders who graduate 4 years later. That is not how we derive these projections. Rather, we observe how many students from one grade level, for example, first grade, appear to be present in the next year in the second grade, and so on and so forth, all the way through to high school graduation. That implicitly begins to reflect the differences by student groups, and in particular minority populations who by high school you'll find fewer and fewer of them appearing and making it to graduation compared to the overall total, or to, for example, whites or Asians. Another question we have is whether or not the methodology we use accounts for, otherwise sort of inputs, anticipated or known policy changes, changes in federal law or public policy that might affect anything, including progress through school, but also, for example, including things like immigration or in-migration to the United States or migration out of the United States. As I mentioned at the beginning, we do not explicitly, we are not modeling per se. Our methodology is a little more simple than that. What we understand to be true based on analyzing the data in great detail is that there are some trends in the school enrollments data, in particular at the high school level, in the recent maybe last 5 to 7 years, that seem to track very closely with what we know to have occurred about immigration in the United States. In particular, we have, California and several other states in the West that have historically had high rates of immigration, and that things such as the deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACA, and other policies like that would stand to have a substantial effect on our population. We do not explicitly model that, but we did see some movement in rough terms in the enrollment data that seemed to track quite closely with what we also saw about immigration over the last 5 to 7 years, such that we don't model it, but it's implicit in the data themselves. We just can't explicitly tease out how much, in a sort of quantified fashion, things change as a result of policies such as economic impacts and things like immigration. We have a couple other questions that I'm going to hold for now and leave for our final few minutes. I'd like to give Rod and Kim a chance to respond, and I'll start with Kim about the topic of promising efforts that are helping to show improvement in academic performance, and they involve partnerships or collaboration between K-12, higher education, community groups, maybe business. So Kim, would you like to comment on partnership efforts that you know about or have been involved in that have achieved success with students?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just first wanted to kind of touch on the issue of policy, and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later. And from a district perspective, there's a lot we don't know about how incoming policies are going to affect kind of the K-12 on-the-ground landscape of what's going on now. So we, whether or not how that will affect the ESA funding, Title I, Title IV funding, et cetera, and kind of what that federal policy landscape will mean for our students. But we're watching and waiting just like everybody else. But in terms of K-12 and higher education partnerships and business collaborations, we know that we would not be here where we are today without our partnerships with a variety of community people. We know that principals and school leaders have so much to do in their buildings that they can't. We know that they alone, along with teachers, can't do this work by themselves. We've been particularly proud of the work we've done with building academic pathways that provide intentional roadmaps for students that map them through, ninth grade onto the completion of a certificate or degree. We've been collaborating on very closely with our partners from Community College of Denver, Community College of Aurora, and some work with Metro State and CU Denver on ensuring that our curriculum presented in the 11th grade for kids is actually meeting what the college expectations will be when they get to their first year in college. We're really proud of piloting some of that work. We've dramatically expanded our dual enrollment partnerships. We have over 13 community college and four-year partners that we offer college opportunities to while students are still in high school. I am part of a collective impact effort called the Denver Education Attainment Network, which is a community partnership with 40 different business and industry and education partners that are working intentionally on increasing completion and then entry into and persistence into higher education as well, and then trying to solve for some of the particulars. So we know that dual enrollment programs are one way to get students through. The students graduating with some concurrent enrollment have a 23% more likely chance of getting into college or persisting in college, but we don't have enough teachers to be able to teach those classes, so we're working with our higher ed partners to address those sorts of things. And then as we build out these Career Connect CTE pathways, the contributions of business and industry in informing what those standards look like so that we're really meeting the workforce expectations, not just what higher ed and or K-12 believes we should be doing, has been critical to developing our Career Connect programming. So I'll leave it right there. If there's any questions, happy to answer them.
Okay, great, thanks. And I will say, so we're going to hear from Rod on the same topic, and then if you have any other questions that you would like answered about the projections themselves or for our panelists, if you can put them in the question pane, we'll be ending the webinar in the last few minutes, just finishing up answering your questions. So Rod, if you want to, I'll turn it back to you, and if you have something else to add about the topic of partnerships, as you said, the great need for them, and if you know of some that are underway in your state and your community and the work you do, and perhaps if you have some thoughts about policies.
Thank you, Pete. Yeah, we have many really positive things going on in Idaho, and one of the most positive things is that 3 years ago our governor created a task force on improving education, and before your eyes glaze over, we all know that most task forces issue their recommendations and then the report sits on a shelf collecting dust. This was not the case in this instance. This task force made up of a very broad and diverse group of stakeholders, from teachers union to the business community. And the task force came up with 21 recommendations, nearly all of them unanimously adopted, that became a blueprint for moving education forward in our state. And I'm happy to say that because of the hard work of the governor, the legislature, the state board, and all the stakeholders, we have adopted and are in various stages of implementing all 21 of those recommendations. And they range from moving to a mastery-based education system to improving intervention for struggling readers. So we expect those policies and those investments to bear great fruit in the next few years. Meanwhile, that was so successful that just last week in the state of the state, the governor announced that he's creating a higher education task force, which would be modeled after the K-12 one. And this task force later this year will recommend as well ways that we can strengthen our higher education system. And there's lots of things we need to look at there, including affordability and structure and retention and graduation. So that too will be made up of a diverse group of stakeholders. IBE is also one of the founders, and I'm on the board of directors of a collective impact group here in Southwest Idaho that represents the 9 Southwest Idaho school districts. And we meet as a group. There are business leaders on there, educators, superintendents, of course, and we are working on getting 3 different areas, getting kids ready for school, academic success, and then how they go on and be successful in post-secondary. And that has been so successful that the State Board of Education is forming similar groups all across our state. It's called the Educate Idaho Network. So it's a very collective impact model. And so there's a lot of great collaboration going on in our state. And I think, you know, I'll leave it at that, but a lot of really positive things.
Thank you. So we have a question here for Kim. And I'll hold on that and address one last question that we had coming in earlier in the session. So someone asked the question about what explains the South region and their strong growth, and being the only region, in fact, that shows growth pretty much year over year, ending above the current level by the early 2030s. We will not have the time to go in depth on that. A short answer is that the South includes many states. We have only defined 4 regions, and so the South includes many strong population states, primarily contributed to that growth by what is happening down in Texas. We will dive into that in much greater detail at our next regional webinar, which is on February 23rd, Thursday, February 23rd at 1:30 p.m. So if that's something interesting for you or impactful for your work, then I'd encourage you to sign up for that webinar so that we can discuss those states' trends. So Kim, the question we had was about minority students and the differences among those who do go on to college, more likely to complete a certificate or an associate's degree, whereas other populations such as white students, Asians, are more likely to go on for a bachelor's or an advanced degree. And so the question is, what do you know about what can be done as the minority population grows and the importance of them holding the necessary degree levels increases for our economy? Do you have some thoughts about what might be done to encourage them and assist them, Hispanic students in particular, to actually achieve higher levels of attainment?
Yeah, and I think some of that work that we're doing is this really intentional work with our collective impact partners, where we're making sure we're doing some pilot programs in Southwest Denver, which has very high numbers of Latino and African American students, to make sure that we are providing all the different opportunities that they need. I think providing exposure to higher education opportunities while still in high school helps to make that transition, or helps to provide additional opportunities for students. And certainly we've seen more students go on to both 2- and 4-year opportunities as a part of the DREAM Act, expanding those opportunities for kids. I think that what is interesting is that less students of color may go on to 4-year opportunities. However, students of color are more successful at, because there are better, I don't know what the reason is, but they tend to persist at a higher rate at 4-year institutions as opposed to at 2-year and technical college opportunities. I think part of what we need to do is make sure that we are redefining, as I said before, what college is, that there is value to every kind of opportunity. for kids. Some of the things that our community college and career and technical programs are doing a really great job of is ensuring that if a student completes a 2-year degree or a certificate, that we're providing a pathway for them to move on into a 4-year pathway as well, or whatever that looks like. I think that we've had a tradition of expectation that one kind of degree or another is preferable or not. And one of the things that we are trying really hard to do in our community is to redefine what college is. The other truth is that most of our students tend to stay in the Denver metro area. I would say that the majority of them are staying within 5 different colleges that are very close to the center of Denver. And so making sure that those opportunities are really valuable for those kids. I don't know if that answered your question exactly, but yeah, that's what I got.
Okay, thank you. And I don't know, Rod, if you had any thoughts or experience with some, in particular, some of the planning and partnerships that you described that addresses that, particularly the need for a recognition for a wide variety of credentials, especially in relation to the current and hoped-for state economy. But then as regards to what have been observed historical differences in what degrees and credentials different student populations pursue, if Idaho is looking at that in regards to its changing demographic and efforts to encourage and help students go on for further education than they might have in the past.
Just a couple of things to touch on that. First of all, we're like Denver and other states. We need people to hold all levels of post-secondary credentials, from career technical to 2-year to PhDs for that matter. So it's really important for us to redefine post-secondary as just not college, but also all these others. But I'll just touch on 2 things that I think we shouldn't lose sight of. Research always shows that families are the biggest indicator of whether students go on, and probably also successful in post-secondary. So somehow, and this gets back to that community effort, that we've got to make sure that parents are involved right from the beginning of their students' education. Don't wait till they're in high school, because by high school it's too late. We need to make sure that parents are involved in their kids' education from the very beginning. The University of Arizona, some people might be familiar with this, has a program called College Academy for Parents. And these aren't for parents of high school students, but when students enter school, they get parents enrolled in this program called College Academy for Parents, and they start talking about education, how important post-secondary is, and I think that is one of the ways that we can ensure that students of color, especially, who may not come from college-going culture and their families, are from the very get-go, they and their parents are exposed to how important education, post-secondary especially, is to the future of their children. And the second thing is that research is also showing that students who participate in CTE at some level in high school, just like in dual credit, that they are actually more successful in post-secondary. So I think without pigeonholing some of our students of color into going into career technical careers, if we can expose them, and all students for that matter, to more CTE in high school, then that may be one pathway to having more of our students go on, not just for CTE certificates in post-secondary, but actually go on for a more advanced degree. So I would say the family, the community, sort of wrapping ourselves around these students from the get-go, and CTE opportunities for students that may help them in post-secondary, along with dual credit, of course.
Thank you. Well, in fact, that will have to be our last comment and answer to a question. We've come to the end of the webinar at this point, And so I would just like to thank, frankly, extend a really big thank you to both Kim and Rod for taking the time to be with us today. Also to everyone who attended this first regional webinar from the newly released Knocking Projections of High School Graduates. When you exit this webinar, you will receive a very brief survey, and we hope you'll take the time to complete it so that we'll be able to use your feedback as we form the next webinar. If you submitted a question we didn't get to, we'll email you to follow up, and I will in fact leave the webinar open for about 5 minutes after we terminate the audio portion so that we can receive any more questions through the question box. You'll receive an email notification when the recording of this webinar is available, so you can share it with your colleagues who weren't able to attend today. And again, I'd encourage you to visit the website where you can download the report and projections. You can access recorded webinars such as this one and other presentations, especially if you would like to have them and use them to bring forward some of these projections into your work. And you can sign up for email notifications about forthcoming products that we'll be producing about the projections. So thank you all, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.